So it's 5:30 Lisbon time, so it's about time that we start. I would like, first of all, to welcome all participants to the debate on electricity industry. What have we learned so far about structural models? I'd like to say that, well, the debate is organized by a Portuguese research institution where many researchers work on power systems organization, management, and economics. The institution is called Institute for Systems Engineering and Computers at Coimbra. Coimbra is, well, just for curiosity, Coimbra is the location of one of the oldest universities in Europe. It's been founded in 1290, so it's quite old. We'd like, first of all, to express our gratitude to our guests, Professor Peter Crampton from the University of Maryland and 𝗪𝗲𝗿𝗪𝗍 from Ohio State University. Well, our main goal with this debate is, as we wrote on the dissemination material, you probably know this, is to contribute to a deeper academic reflection on the topic and to provide new insights that can help regulators, industry, and academia to work toward a better consumer-centric endeavor, which is probably, I suppose everyone will agree that it's the main goal of organizing the electricity industry. We are aware of the fact that this topic may have been absent from the mainstream literature recently, but actually recent contributions in the literature suggest a renewed interest in leveraging decades of experience with liberalized markets in order to make a more objective comparison between the two models. Well, just to provide a quick overview of the present status of the organization of the electricity market in the world, I can tell you that, well, as of July 2024, according to the Global Power Market Structures Database, which was updated in July 2024, there were about 72 countries with a vertically integrated structure in the electricity business. Most of them are developing economies with lower electrification, but cover entire populations. I mean, and they represent about 1 to 2 billion consumers. Billion, American billion. I mean, in Europe, we say thousands of millions, right? The single buyer model, I mean, it's vertically integrated from the single buyer downwards, but it's open to competition eventually at the generation stage. 89 countries. There's a mix of developing and middle income countries, and this represents also 1 to 2 billion consumers with no retail choice. And then fully liberalized markets, they're present in 69 countries, including Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, with near full electrification of the countries, and they represent between 1.5 and 2 billion consumers with retail choice. Well, in a rough global split, we would say that about 2 to 4 billion electricity consumers receive service via vertically integrated or single buyer systems with no, well, limited or no retail competition. Usually in these cases, when there is single buyer present in the system, big consumers, I mean, industry and eventually some commerce are entitled to shop around, but no, that doesn't happen with low voltage and small consumers. And around 1.5 to 2 billion have access to liberalized retail markets. Well, in a little bit outdated report, I mean, from International Energy Agency dated 2020, we would say that wholesale competition, I mean, at the generation side, fully competitive markets cover 40% of global electricity demand. 47% have a hybrid model, unbundled or partial competition. And the remaining 13% correspond to fully vertically integrated monopolies, right? As for retail competition, this is wholesale competition. As for retail competition, fully liberalized retail markets cover 22% of global demand, 45% in partially competitive retail, and 33% in fully regulated monopoly systems. So these numbers are a little bit outdated, just 4 years old. So they probably are different right now. And we all know that liberalized market is advancing and taking progressively more areas of the world to the vertically integrated structure. But the situation as for now is more or less like this. So the relative importance of the two systems. Well, now I would like to present our guests to whom we have to express our great appreciation for having accepted our invitation. Thank you very much, Noah, and thank you very much, Peter.
You're welcome.
And we'll begin with 𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗏. Well, 𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗏 is an award-winning economist and public policy professor at the Ohio State University. He specializes in energy and environmental policy and economics, economic resilience to natural hazards, risk and decision analysis, and applied public policy analysis. 𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗏's research evaluates the relationship between government regulation and markets, for example, electricity markets or carbon markets, and how the design of markets for critical infrastructure impacts society. His research also evaluates how businesses are affected by disruptions to critical infrastructure that occur in disasters and what those businesses can do to cost-effectively bounce back. Similarly, his research also evaluates how decision makers of all types respond to disruptions, disasters, and government regulations, market designs, and policies. His research has been published in a broad array of peer-reviewed journals and government publications. These include, among others, Energy Economics, the Energy Journal, Risk Analysis, the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, the International Journal of Production Economics, the Natural Hazards Review, and etc. He serves as an associate editor for Natural Hazards Review and the Journal of Critical Infrastructure Policy. His work has been funded by an array of federal, state, private, and nonprofit organizations. These include the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, the NSF, the National Science Foundation, the DOE, Department of Energy, the National Center for Middle Market, the John Randolph and Dora Haynes Foundation, the Center for Climate Strategies, and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the DARPA, as you know. He is a fellow at two U.S. Department of Homeland Security Centers of Excellence, namely the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute at the University of Illinois and the Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Threats and Emergencies at the University of Southern California. He is the 2012 co-recipient of the National Award for Economic Analysis from the Regional Economic Models Incorporated. He received his doctorate from the University of Southern California. Well, now for Peter Crampton. Well, Peter Crampton is an emeritus professor of economics at the University of Maryland and an international research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Research on Collective Goods. He is a leading researcher in market design. His research on auctions and market design, focusing on the design of complex markets, spans a wide range of industries, including electricity, as we are interested today, finance, and communications, where he has introduced innovative market designs. Numerous governments have sought Crampton's counsel, and he has advised dozens of bidders in major auctions. He served as an independent director of the ERCOT board, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Engineering from Cornell University and his PhD in business from Stanford University. His work on electricity market design began with an influential report that identified flaws in the market rules proposed for the independent system operator of New England. The work proposed solutions that would better address market objectives. Over the next decade, these recommendations were adopted in the stakeholder process, sometimes after significant problems were observed in practice. The need for capacity market performance incentives is a prime example. Crampton advised on the design of capacity markets in North America, Europe, and South America, contributing many influential papers on the topic. Well, Peter Crampton's recent research has addressed the critical market failures that have hindered efficient investment and stifled innovation in electricity markets, such as incomplete markets, market power, uncertainty, and poor trading technologies. This research, once adopted, holds the promise to expedite the net zero transition. It leverages straightforward and robust market designs that foster innovation and competition, bringing necessary flexibility for reliable and resilient electricity in a setting with high renewable penetration. It also identifies the need and feasibility of involving the demand side, particularly during extreme weather. Such a market significantly enhances price incentives, enabling efficient investment and operation of participants' resources and benefiting retail consumers. The result is a net zero economy that provides reliable and resilient electricity at the least cost. Well, it remains to say that, well, these biographies were chosen from the invitees' material, right? So just to begin with, and to explain to the audience how we organize this debate, we are going to give the word to Peter Crampton and Noah Dalmedy in the first place, to let them, during 10 minutes each, let them make his initial statement, and in the remaining half an hour, we will open the debate to everyone, right? So I don't know, we haven't settled who should speak first, so let me decide and begin with Peter. Do you agree?
Certainly, that's fine.
Okay with you, right? Peter, go on.
So I'm going to share my screen. Because I do have a few slides. And my focus has been on the design of electricity markets. And electricity markets, as you know, are designed, and that electricity is not something where you can just let the market rip. And, so I don't use the word deregulation. I always use the word restructured when the markets are liberalized. Because the design is very much important and essential. In market design, we start with the goal, and the goal is reliable electricity at least cost. There's two elements to this. One is short-run efficiency, getting the least cost operation of the existing resources that are present. And this could be both on the supply side and the demand side. The focus historically has been on the supply side, but needs to be much more on the demand side going forward. And we're actually in the restructured markets, we're very good at short-run efficiency. And we've had a history of continuous improvement in these markets with respect to short-run efficiency. So that's been incredibly positive and helpful for countries around the world that can just sort of jump on the current state of the art. The challenge has been long-run efficiency, and that is getting the investment incentives to drive the right quantity and mix of resources. And you need both of these. They're both essential. The long-run efficiency has been much more challenging, and it's not challenging just for the restructured markets, the liberalized markets. It's also that's a huge challenge for the monopoly markets. I'm going to say a few words about what are the components of this successful restructured market design and how we can move through continuous improvement to a framework that brings us to the first best and accelerates the energy transition that is happening globally and represents an enormous challenge for every country. For me, the starting point of a successful design is the spot market. So that's the short-run efficiency of the existing resources, and this comes from a scheduling market, which in the US is the day-ahead market, and a dispatch market, which is in the US we call it the real-time market. So day ahead, we schedule the resources and make adjustments throughout the day. And then in real time, we optimally dispatch the system. And through all this, we're sending robust price signals to the market participants to encourage them to follow the instructions of the system operator, which is leading to highly efficient operations of existing resources. Now, the component that's missing, which encourages the good investment incentives, is robust forward trade. And so now it's well understood that forward trade is important in all restructured electricity markets because there's a lot of needs and risks that need to be managed, and forward trade does this well. But we need to make the forward trade more robust and more powerful and simpler than it is, and more transparent than it is currently. And that's been a major focus of my research in the last several years. And my research lab is focused pretty much 90% on this task. And we are making progress. The spot market in the United States, they're all nodal markets. And I know Europe is having this debate between nodal and zonal and one price in each country. And that debate has been over for decades in the United States. Nodal is the way to operate the market. There actually is consensus among electricity market designers in Europe that's the case as well. And yet politically, it's been very challenging to get implemented in the United States. I put up this picture. This is Texas, the ERCOT market. And this is what nodal pricing normally looks like. There's thousands of nodes, all different prices. But essentially, the prices are all extremely similar. And that's what it looks like most of the time, because most of the time, there isn't serious congestion. But because of outages, because whether it's transmission or large units, transmission congestion appears, or the weather conditions, all sorts of things. These tend to be transient. They change the prices. They motivate the parties to perform consistent with the value of electricity that is reflected in the congested network. And that's the big advantage. So, this is one point where there are some differences, but I think that there's commonality that's absolutely what we need. Shortage pricing is another important component, which says what happens when we reach a situation of shortage or get very near to shortage. And here in the United States, we use an operating reserve demand curve in our markets to basically express what happens to price when we're at or near shortage. And this is incredibly powerful motivator for parties to perform when they're needed. It is a core component of a first best solution to the electricity market design problem. We have to engage the demand side, and that's been a chief problem for decades. Price responsive demand, as we introduce low carbon technologies like electric vehicles, are going to want to participate in the electricity market in a significant way. And they create a lot of value for the owner of the low carbon technology and for the system by bringing flexibility. So that's the integration of having robust price responsive demand, or as bid demand in the case of large consumers or aggregators who can bid directly in the market, is incredibly important and has to be enabled by the future market designs. Same is the case for distributed energy resources that have to be, such as solar and battery, which have to be integrated into the system. The market, a well-designed market does this in a technology neutral way that creates the flexibility that's needed. And then finally, the forward energy market is a way to enable transparent and efficient trade with high granularity in both time and location over a extended period. And what this provides is an efficient price signal to motivate investment where it's needed and when it's needed, as well as the strong performance incentives. The forward energy market that my research lab has developed and is proposed in markets globally is extremely powerful, simple, and it's something that's best conducted by the system operator, because the system operator has all the information. They're good at conducting optimized markets where they're balancing supply and demand, and determining the trade that maximizes social welfare. For the market participants, it enables a way for them to manage their risk, manage their needs, and addresses potential market failures, such as incomplete markets, market power, and uncertainty, all of which reduce the efficiency of the market. Through the transition, we have more and more renewables that play an increasingly important role. That implies a greater need for flexibility. And it's the efficient price signals that are going to drive that, motivate that flexibility. So efficient price signals become increasingly important, which is why I'm emphasizing nodal pricing to send the right locational signals. If you don't do that, there are ways to redispatch resources, but they harm incentives and are very expensive. Shortage pricing is what's motivating the parties to provide the flexibility when it's needed most, and the forward energy market is enabling the parties to have the information that they need to make good investment decisions and operational decisions, so that they can manage their risk and needs. And a big component of this to drive the continuous improvement that all electricity markets need is good governance. And so that you have a governance process that constantly brings improvements as issues are identified, and especially can be identified quickly, and solutions brought forward and implemented quickly is important. And that's been a big challenge in the markets to date, is that it's taken too long to get the improvements that we need. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter.
Unshare.
If you could care to stop sharing. Yes, okay. Thank you. Now I give the word to Noah, if you don't mind starting.
Great. Am I sharing my screen okay?
Yes, it's perfect. Okay.
Great. And thank you very much, Peter. That was wonderful. I think I agree with everything you said, particularly about short and long run efficiency and the need for good governance, as well as the importance of the demand side. And I'm going to be spending a little bit of my reserved time talking about the demand side. As a public policy professor, that's a big focus of my work, is on the demand side and on the actual customer's experience with these markets. One of the things I'd like to start off is by reminding people about the guiding principles that vertically integrated or regulated processes are governed by. And, you know, I don't know if this is going to upset anyone, and I hope not, but I'd like to make the statement here that the ultimate goal of both regulation and deregulation is essentially the same. Both want efficient markets that are fair. They want competition where there should be competition. They want prices that are going to be inclusive for consumers. And what I have here on the screen are some basic principles that guide the regulatory process. First and foremost is prudence. In regulatory proceedings, typically at the subnational level, we see a requirement in U.S. jurisdictions for rates to be just and reasonable. And that dates back all the way to 1883 with a landmark Supreme Court case in the United States that governed rail traffic. Rates should also, or the regulatory process should also be governed by the principle of universal access, where no one should be excluded from the market, where no one, regardless of their ability to pay, should be excluded from accessing critical infrastructure that is essential for lifeline services. Affordability is also a key governing principle of a regulatory process, ensuring that rates are affordable and rates are fair. Many regulatory commissions are also governed by a statutory mission, and typically that statutory mission is one of reliability, one of low cost, and one of either safety or security. And so those are the statutory missions that most regulatory agencies are governed by, typically by enabling legislation at the state level or at the subnational level. Transparency is a typical guiding principle of a regulator, making sure that what is oftentimes in a market environment restricted from public view for trade secrets purposes and for a variety of things, variety of reasons, information that a market doesn't necessarily convey to consumers or to voters is open and transparent in a regulatory process that is guided by these principles. Independence, ensuring that the regulated industry is independent of the regulators, also an essential governing principle of a regulatory process. Risk and risk management, and making sure that market participants and consumers are bearing equivalent and fair amounts of risk is also an important governing principle of a regulatory commission. And regulatory commissions are governed by the principle of adversarialism. It's important to note that under these processes, almost like little courtrooms, regulatory commissions have an adversarial legal process where interveners from all sides and all walks and stripes of life can come and have a seat at the table and engage in an adversarial regulatory process. This can include members of interveners who have interests in the environment. This can include interveners who have consumer protection interests. This can include regulatory agencies themselves, like consumer protection organizations and consumer advocates offices. And this can include the regulated industry itself, the oil industry, the gas industry, telecom, writ large. And so I think it's important that we begin by expressing that whether or not we're talking about a vertically integrated market or a restructured or deregulated market, they both have the same objectives in mind, but fundamentally different processes for achieving those ends. Now, there was an original intent and purpose behind restructuring to begin with. And I think it's important that we remind ourselves of why we decided to get away from that adversarial regulatory process and what were some of the problems that motivated restructuring to begin with. And the initial purpose dating back to the 1990s was to open up the market to greater competition with the overall goal of lowering prices for retail consumers. If you think about the promises that were made by politicians in states like California, here in Ohio, New York, and so on, and internationally, the promises to consumers, to voters, was that their bills would go down and they would see more efficient, more reliable service. Secondly, the original intent and purpose was to get away from monopolistic pricing of generation and transmission and replace it with market-based prices. And third, to shift risk away from consumers and onto market participants. And that was also a key motivation behind deregulation or restructuring to begin with. Now, how are we supposed to get there? and I don't want to sound overly critical or overly controversial, but I think just because we have a market design that works well on a whiteboard doesn't mean it will work well in actual implementation. What are some of the important steps that we have to go through from a policy implementation standpoint to actually implement a functional restructured market? Well, first and foremost, we needed to have separation or unbundling of generation and distribution through divestiture. It was important that those monopoly utility companies that own generation assets that had a GenCo would separate or unbundle those generation assets so that they would no longer be a monopolist on both the supply and the demand sides of the market. Second, we needed to have an independent systems operator, essentially an air traffic controller, run the wholesale market, as Peter was just describing. And third, we needed to have competition in the retail market, which is the functional mechanism by which the benefits of efficiency in the wholesale market, when realized, can be passed through to retail consumers. In other words, we can only have an efficient retail market that will realize those promises to end consumers when we have gone through the process of ensuring that the wholesale market has addressed those concerns. And I would argue address both the short and long run concerns that Peter was describing. And fourth, we needed to have a regulatory commission, a regulatory process that was divorced or separated from setting rates except for local distribution service. We needed to have a process that would insulate generation pricing from distribution pricing. And why are these things important? And why am I raising these four issues? Well, each of these issues have been broken in implementation at the state level in most of the 14 retail restructured jurisdictions in the US. Companies in Ohio, for example, didn't have functional separation of their generation and their distribution. What ended up happening? Well, through political compromise, state legislatures and regulatory commissions allowed the distribution utilities to create a separate spin-off LLC corporation, and they sold the power plants to themselves. AEP sold its power plants here in Ohio to AEP Generation Resources. First Energy sold its power plants to First Energy Solutions. And you can see how there would be a bit of a mixed bag in terms of economic incentives when that happens. If those power plants were to, say, lose money, let's say during, say, a shale boom, they would be incentivized to find some way to then pass through their losses on the wholesale market to their retail, captive regulated retail customers on the retail portions of their bills. And that's exactly what we see happening across the country. In the US, we see consumers' bills inversely related to the market dynamics in the wholesale market. Let me show you a couple of examples and the means by which this occurs. So this is just an example of a recent utility bill here from Central Ohio. And as we all know, there are three main components that a consumer will receive a bill for: generation, transmission, and distribution. And jurisdictionally, legally, a regulatory commission at the state level can only set rates for distribution service. But if you go and you look at a customer's bill, you only see what I'm showing you here on the left. Customers in the US really don't see what's actually making up all of these charges. And what they actually get on their bill is about 37 different riders. Here's another example of a more clear rider from a customer's bill in Toledo. They see about 37 different riders. Many of these riders are added by a regulatory commission that is passing through losses of its generation affiliates, of a distribution utility's generation affiliates to retail customers. It's unlawful, and yet it has persisted for several years now. There have been numerous court cases and corruption cases, which I'll talk about in a little bit today if time permits, dealing with these issues. And what happens? How does this happen? Well, we have created at the state level across the country regulatory mechanisms that allow distribution utilities to open up individualized cases without going through the full litany of requirements and open books process that you would go through for prudency review through, say, a regulated process like a rate case, we allow these utility commissions to open up and allow the utilities through the commissions to open up little cases, mini regulatory cases called ESP cases, where they can open up an individual case for a rider, an add-on charge to customer bills. And they can add on riders for all sorts of non-germane reasons, Save the Children rider, the Patriot Act rider, whatever you want to call it. And you can see the name of some of the riders here. For example, this rider I'm showing you right here, the Legacy Generation Resource rider, that's a coal subsidy to the coal plants on the Ohio River. And consumers pay a portion. There's 2 of those riders that populate across the state. And what you see is as a result of these riders being added by a regulated body, a regulatory body, being added onto customers' bills through the distribution pricing mechanism, because we failed to implement the process efficiently, consumers' actual lived experiences with deregulation is fundamentally different from that original promise and that original premise. Now, we did a study some years ago where we looked at the actual realized total bill of retail customers. And this is the statewide average retail electric bill from actual bills, not necessarily from EIA data, but from real bills, where you actually see all these riders populated that are not necessarily reported to our EIA agency at the federal level here in the US. And after January of 2009, when retail choice was implemented in Ohio, we saw a dramatic increase, a statistically significant and robust increase in the consumer's experience with electricity prices in Ohio. Similarly, we see a direct and strongly statistically significant inverse relationship at 10 to the minus 4th between the customer's bills and the wholesale market. If deregulation was doing what it was supposed to do, we should see efficiencies of the wholesale market pass through to retail consumers. Maybe there might be a lag of a year or so. Maybe there might be a 3, 6, 12-month lag between when wholesale price efficiencies pass through to retail consumers. But we shouldn't see an inverse and statistically significant relationship at 10 to the minus 4th between when prices go up on the wholesale market, prices go down for retail consumers, and vice versa. And what is the functional mechanism of this perverse process? It's that rider mechanism, where the regulatory commission itself has been co-opted through this misapplied regulatory process. They add additional riders onto consumers' electric bills so that when those power plants lose money on the wholesale market, they're allowed to turn around and charge their captive regulated customers on the distribution portions of their bills to compensate for those losses on the wholesale market. And so we see this really perverse process that takes place. Now, I have several examples through a variety of studies that we're running. We're collecting bills and interviewing customers through in-depth customer interviews. We're running conjoint experiments in Ohio and in Pennsylvania right now, where I can show you, and if time permits later today, I will show you several examples of customers' lived experiences, what the actual retail customer sees on their bills. And it will be shocking to you, some of the experiences that the customers have received in these markets. Now, I just want to go back to my original premise, and that is just because we see something that will work in theory, and it works as a set of equations in a research paper or on our whiteboard or chalkboard, doesn't mean it will actually be implemented in that way when it comes down to the actual lobbyists and the political processes that will actually implement these markets. And so there's a fundamental divergence that exists between the implementation process and the theory behind the markets. And I generally take the position that our wholesale markets in these restructured jurisdictions are operating quite efficiently. I agree with Peter wholeheartedly that we also have a long way to go on the forward markets, a long way to go in terms of longer run efficiencies, but I believe that those wholesale markets are functioning very efficiently. But the mechanisms by which the benefits of those wholesale markets get passed through to retail consumers, small businesses, and households, that deserves considerable attention on the policy implementation side. And so with that, I'll go ahead and end this portion of our talk and open it up. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Noah and Peter, for your very insightful initial statements. I guess we have collected a lot of information that will be useful for the debate. Well, I now give the word to whoever wants to use it, or you may just ask something through the chat channel, or you may raise your hand, and we will try to give you the word as far as possible according to the order through which you will raise your hands. I'm not pretty sure that I will be able to do that always, but I will try to. Okay. So I don't know, maybe just as some sort of icebreaker, I would like to defy Peter and Noah to look at a particular question that we would like that I would like to pose. I mean, the original motivation, as Noah just said, one of the original motivations in the early days for the deregulation or restructuring of the market was achieving lower, or eventually the lowest electricity prices possible to benefit the consumers, right? So my question and my curiosity is, we know that life is not a laboratory, right? But well, knowing this and knowing that we cannot go back in time and repeat experiments and so on, so from a scientific point of view, I mean, from a scientific method point of view, which methodology could we envisage to assess whether this goal, I mean, to ensure the lowest possible electricity prices to consumers, this goal is achieved, given the fact that there is no obvious way of assessing what would have been the result of not restructuring the market, right? So where the market has been restructured, prices have evolved in a certain way. After the liberalization or restructuring. So what would have happened? I know of some papers, namely in the United Kingdom in the early days of restructuring of the United Kingdom system, where some researchers, namely from the London Business School, made some kind of simulations in order to understand what would have been this result if the vertically integrated structure would have prevailed instead of liberalizing the market. But that was, I know, very ancient papers. So given the experience that we have accumulated, namely the studies that Noah and Peter have been developing lately, what do you think could be a way of trying to assess whether that particular goal of ensuring the lowest prices to end consumers, how could we assess that if this particular goal has been actually achieved in spite of the distortions that Noah has just reported to us, right? What do you think could be the method to try to assess this?
Let's see, if I may. First,
Yes,
let me say that I do agree with Noah that there's many states in the United States that have bungled the restructuring and along the lines that Noah has presented. So I agree, and my main focus has been on the wholesale markets and getting the wholesale markets right, because I think that that's the, if you don't have that the wholesale market is what the retail market rests upon, and so it's really important to have a wholesale market that works if you're going the restructured route. There is a diversity of behaviors and responses throughout the United States. And Ohio is certainly, I agree, has done a bad job. And but there's other states that have done a good job. And so what I look for is best practice. So are there any places, I mean, it's certainly good to look at all the states and all the countries and see what folks are doing and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And I think, Antonio, that's to your question, is like, how can you tell, whether something's working or not. And I think that the most compelling evidence of competitive markets comes from legitimate price comparisons. And NOAA's making those price comparisons at the retail level, which is ultimately what really matters to consumers. And I'm more focused on the wholesale level, thinking that the regulators can harness the process and ultimately give consumers prices that are that stem from the wholesale markets rather than from some convoluted regulatory process. And that's turned out to be very challenging in the United States, and I would say, overall, extremely challenging. I think Texas stands out as one market that actually has gotten the whole thing pretty darn well, a solid wholesale market and a effectively regulated retail choice market that has enabled competition and has driven prices down for consumers. So I think Texas stands out as a prime example where at the retail level, the consumers are paying less than what they did under the monopoly model. So that's one example. But I also agree with Noah that there's lots of states where the experience hasn't been so bright. And it is very important to look at the total cost to the consumer. And sometimes there's a lot less transparency about that total cost. And that's a big problem. And so for me, transparency is extremely important in guiding the regulatory process in a more productive way. And we've certainly seen that in the wholesale markets. And we need to see more of that in the retail markets. But in particular, one of the problems is if you have a monopoly utility structure in your state, then, and that is, you don't properly unbundle the generation, then you've got a very loud voice to influence the regulatory process, to put in these riders that Snow has been talking about, and that creates lots of problems. And even with a highly efficient wholesale market, the consumer isn't often seeing the benefits of the low wholesale prices.
Well, thank you, Peter. Noah, do you want to add something?
Yes, thank you very much. I have a lot to say, and Peter opened up a few important cans. One, let me just start by addressing the academic literature, Antonio, that you started describing. As a peer reviewer and as in an editorial role, I receive and have reviewed many papers on this topic. And I don't say this lightly, but many of these papers that attempt to address that counterfactual problem and to historically evaluate whether or not people would be better off with vertically integrated versus restructured markets are wanting at best. Generally, I have one guiding principle as a reviewer of those papers, and what I tend to see is that the papers that fail to control for the natural gas price, particularly in markets where natural gas is the marginal input fuel, tend to find robust and statistically significant savings associated with restructuring or deregulation. Because they tend to conflate, given the study period, they tend to conflate savings associated with the shale boom with savings that are associated with the policy implementation. And as soon as you have an estimating equation that accounts for the price of natural gas, the policy effect tends to wash out as non-significant and in most cases even have a negative impact. I agree that Texas, well, I'll come to Texas in just a moment. So that literature, I think, has created, because it's not such a strong literature and because the counterfactual problem is so challenging, I think that literature needs some maturation. I think we need to see better papers and better submissions and better studies and more funding for studies of that nature because of the societal importance of this work. Now, regarding the comparison across states, I agree that Ohio has made some mistakes, but I believe also, and possibly in disagreement with Peter, that Ohio is different from the other states. I believe Ohio is in many ways arguably one of the most robust retail choice markets, as is Pennsylvania. And in our study, we're seeing some of the exact same effects. Let me share my screen one more time. I'd like to show you something to this effect. We did a study of all the retail choice offers in Ohio and in Pennsylvania over a decade period of time. And so I'll just cut to the chase and say that what we found in a market that is very robust. We have about 160 different companies supplying retail choice offers in each of the service territories. Each day, excuse me, about 160 different offers by about 50 different companies, forgive me. And so we've got a pretty robust market in both Ohio and in Pennsylvania. And in our study, just the Ohio data alone had about 3 million offers. And we have all the details of the offers in a database. We know the perquisites that are offered if these retailers offered people flat screen televisions or gift cards or free car washes or whatever. And we know if they were fixed or variable rates. We know the maturity of the offers. We know if they have fixed price offers. We have all kinds of details on the offers. And I'll just cut to the chase and say over a 10-year period of time in a very, very robust retail marketplace, we still find that 72.1% of the offers were more expensive than even the utility's default standard service offer. I'll repeat that. Over a 10-year period of time in a very competitive retail marketplace where these retailers are purchasing their supply from PJM, from the wholesale market, for full requirement services, including capacity and ancillary services, about 3/4 of the offers have been more expensive than even the utility's default offer. And I'll show you one more graphic here. Among the offers that had a savings, on average, that savings was between 5 and 10% below the default utility standard service offer. When they did have, among those 3/4 of offers that were more expensive, they were on average 25 to 35% more expensive. So there's a fundamental market breakdown on the retail side that is entire, and this is just for generation pricing, because this is retail choice. And so the problem, and I'll go ahead and turn off the screen sharing here. The problem that I'm expressing is that even if you're focusing on a segment of the market that is based entirely on an efficient wholesale market process, at the retail level, you still see distortions in those markets. And there are studies out there that compare vertically integrated markets with retail choice markets or restructured markets, oftentimes tend to focus only on the utility's standard service offer price as their comparison group. They don't compare to the actual observed, real, lived experiences of retail customers who are on these offers, 72.1% of which are well above the default utility service price. So we have a metrics problem in this research. And I'll go ahead and end my response there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, I knew that this was a difficult question because it's an eternal question anyway. And I suppose that, well, actually, the research on this topic is as you said, Noah, very difficult to perform because of the intrinsic nature of the problem of the research question anyway. So I would like to stress the need to have you, the rest of the audience, to make questions, to profit from having with us. very qualified researchers. Okay. Oh, Luis, okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
There are a few questions in chat, actually.
Oh, really? Sorry. Okay. I didn't
Yeah, I
see
saw
it.
one that was directed to me that was about how do I envision demand side flexibility? So how does the consumer, how do you engage the demand side? And my view is that we actually have some experience with this in places where they have dynamic rates, like in the UK and Texas and so on. And people do today respond to price. But the way I envision it in the future is that the innovative retail providers will create value for consumers by operating by facilitating the operation of their low carbon technologies. For example, that's the way I do it here in California right now, which is I've got batteries on the side of my garage, I've got solar panels, I've got an electric vehicle in the garage, and my service provider that's managing these is attempting to create value for me by looking at with knowledge of what the price that I pay for electricity is, how it varies by time of day, is just optimizing these resources to create value for me. Now, the big problem that we have in California is the prices that I'm being paid have nothing to do with the wholesale price. There's no linkage whatsoever. So at 12 noon, I get paid 65 cents for delivering some solar power to the grid. And that's ridiculous because at 12 noon on a day like today in California, the social value of that generation is negative. So I actually should be paying to, this disconnect, and it's sort of part of the problem that Noah has emphasized, is that there's this disconnect between the retail prices that the consumer sees and feels and the wholesale prices. And so what we have to have is a market design where those two are linked together. And that, yes, we have to figure out a way to pay for the transmission and distribution, but we need to do that in an efficient way and then send the efficient price signals to the wholesale participants and the retail participants. And we do not do that. We certainly don't do that in California. Texas comes much closer to doing that.
Noah, do you want to add something to this, to reply to this question? Because
No,
we have
but-
other questions following, so okay, go ahead.
No, I think Peter emphasized the point that I wanted to make, and that disconnect between the retail customers' economic incentives and the wholesale market definitely need to be addressed. I think there are some innovative policy mechanisms for handling that problem. I will say that the one thing that is giving me some optimism about addressing that problem, and I don't know to what degree there's interest today for a discussion of this, but that is the tremendous increase in our interconnection queues for storage. We're seeing a 19% in PJM, 19% of our interconnection queue is battery storage at grid level. And when we do see that degree of storage come online, that is a fundamental game changer in that ability to address that disconnect between the retail and the wholesale incentives.
Okay, we have other questions. The following question in the chat is, how do you see the impact? But this is addressed to Noah, although of course, Peter, you're able to, you're totally free to also intervene about this. How do you see the impact of no, the previous question is not particularly to Noah, it's to both of you. Since the wholesale market performs in an effective way and the problem is located on the retail part, would a heavily regulated or even a state monopoly on the retail side be more socially beneficial? Either of you.
We effectively have that in California for residential and small commercial tariffs, those GS1 and 2 size tariffs. I don't know that that is more effective. I tend to view this as, and getting back to Peter's concluding premise about the importance of good governance. And I'll tell you a little story about Ohio, and this is similar in many other states. I would encourage researchers to go and do a little bit of homework on the backgrounds of our regulatory processes for how one becomes a commissioner in these states. In Ohio, for example, the governor gets 4 picks for any open seat on the 5-person Public Utilities Commission. But those individuals have to go before a nominating council, which is a legislatively decided body. Now, for the last 15 years, the chairman of that commission, of that appointment council, was a person who was the chief lobbyist for First Energy. And he essentially got to direct who was going to be the appointees for the Public Utilities Commission, and hand-selected individuals who would be favorable to industry. And as a result of that process, we ended up with the largest federal corruption and bribery case in our state's history. The former chairman of the Public Utilities Commission, Sam Randazzo, his home was raided by the FBI, and he was under indictment, federal indictment, in a large bribery and corruption case involving the First Energy Utility, the CEO of the First Energy Utility, as well as the head of the state legislature, the Speaker of the House, Larry Householder, and the head of the state GOP. All of whom were indicted in a federal investigation, and civil cases continue. I was the first witness to testify in the federal case. These processes that allow these industry favorable regulators, one of our regulators in Ohio, for example, was former chief counsel to AEP with no cooling off period, that many states have cooling off period legislation. Raises fundamental questions, I think, about the regulatory process itself. Those guiding principles that I started off by describing, I think, are critically important, but I think they've been abrogated and modified through a pattern of practice. And I don't think that the answer to this disconnect that Peter and I are describing is continuing on our current path of regulation at the state level. I think we need good governance, and we need reforms that will improve the governance processes at the state level.
Well, I guess that this raises also, or eventually, a very connected question with this, which is the transparency and above all, the democratic control of the regulatory process and the regulatory bodies. I don't know, Peter, do you want to add something to what Noah just said?
Well, no, I agree that this corruption and the destruction of independence is a huge issue. And so, yes, we have to see reforms that, and transparency is a good way to do it. I think that one of the big dangers of the monopoly utility model is that you do have these dominant players that then can influence the political process in a disproportionate way, and the consumers are quite vulnerable to this, and that's sort of the nature of the beast. I think one way to manage it is to simplify the regulatory decision making and establish a governance that prioritizes sort of what's needed to bring an efficient market. And that it's very challenging. and I don't, it's sort of the basic problem that we have in virtually every country is that if there's no leadership that's pushing for an efficient market, then that's a big problem. I think one reason that electricity works as well as it does is that the politicians know the most important thing is keeping the lights on. That if there's any serious outages, then it's big trouble for them. And so there's been, in many of the markets, there's been a dominant voice has been to make sure that we get the engineering right. And when we then make sure that we get the economics right, and the politicians are sort of third fiddle, then we're in a much better world. But it's very hard to accomplish that because the politicians don't like to be the third fiddle.
Maybe we should rethink the democratic control of regulatory processes, I guess. We have several other questions, but we are just, and we just passed the scheduled end time for this debate. It's now 6 minutes beyond the previously defined time for ending this debate. So I have to ask you, do you think you have eventually 5 minutes to answer the next question and leave the others unanswered, that we will have time to give replies to all the questions that are in the chat, which I have to thank very much to the audience, because this is a very high level of participation, and regrettably we have to keep to be able to not to ask too much to our guests, because they have reserved 1 hour for this debate, and we don't want to be abusive. So we have the following question was particularly to Noah, but of course you may be free to both answer what you want. How do you see the impact of PV generation as distributed generation by houses as a source of uncertainty? How this should be seen from the perspective of deregulation, in which the objective is to remove the risk from end users?
Yeah, great question. So I think this gets back to the astute point that Peter made from the outset about long-run efficiency. And many, I don't know if many of our participants today are familiar with the concept of municipal aggregation. But in many retail restructured jurisdictions, we have municipal aggregation that allows municipalities by ballot initiative to vote to have a default electricity service for their municipality at the residential and/or small commercial level, purchased services from a retail supplier in bulk. And many of these aggregation mechanisms, aggregation processes are doing just that, where they're purchasing PV and essentially going 100% renewable or 100% solar or wind or both for their municipality, their county, or their township. And it is increasingly becoming a dominant process. I know here where I live in the city of Columbus, we passed Senate Columbus Issue 1 in 2020, and the entire city went to solar-based electricity at a rate that is about the same as the utility's default service rate. And passing through those costs to retail consumers and that uncertainty through a municipal aggregation mechanism is, in my view, a much safer way of passing through those costs, or rather passing through those risks. A consumer faces considerable risk in the investment and uncertainty of investment for things like rooftop solar. But at the municipal level, at a larger scale where the economies of scale are more favorable, I see a lot less risk potential for retail consumers, particularly through that retail choice mechanism of aggregation.
Thanks a lot. Noah, Peter, do you want to add something to what Noah just said?
No, I agree with that. And we are seeing it, and we have that in California as well. And it's yeah, overall, the utility scale solar is much more efficient than the rooftop solar, and so enabling what's more efficient, I'm all for it.
Okay, so I guess we just, we're 10 minutes beyond the schedule. I would like just, in the first place, to thank very much to all the audience who were patiently remaining here to listen to our discussion. I hope everyone agrees that this was a very interesting debate with different points of view, and especially with lots of new information that I personally didn't know about in terms of the American electricity market. Several details that I was not aware of in terms of all the operating issues regarding the regulation and how that impacts the way that consumers see their bills and see their well-being inside the electricity market. In the first place, thank to the audience and to the questions that several of you have posted and are in the chat. We will keep them in record, and we will try to make something out of them eventually with the cooperation of Peter and Noah, if possible. Well, in second place, I would like to renew my big thank to Noah and Peter for their availability to be with us. This is Friday, this is near the weekend, so it's even more valuable for you to be able to stay with us for such a long time now, beyond 1 hour, an hour and a quarter of an hour as well, almost. So thank you very much for your cooperation. I hope we will stay in touch and talk about and discuss these things further in the future. This is the first debate of a series of debates that we at INESC Coimbra want to organize about several issues regarding the electricity market. And keep attentive to the further announcements that we will make in the future about this particular matter of the electricity market. The following will probably be about the promotion of energy efficiency, depending on the environment. I mean, how do we see and how have we looked at the experience acquired within restructured markets and vertically integrated markets in terms of programs for fostering energy efficiency at the demand side. So this is going to be our next theme. We don't know how long it will take to prepare the next debate, but please, we will address you anyway again when we are ready for launching the new debate. So thank you very much to all of you, especially to Peter and Noah. Thank you very much again.
My pleasure.
I wish all of you a very nice weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.